Lucky to Be Here is a podcast that showcases the stories of those who took the leap to build their lives and careers across countries. They share their stories, lessons, and advice to show us what is possible and what it takes to be an international student and professional. Because there is a lot that goes into building your life abroad, one day at a time. We are more than just lucky to be here. I am your host, Dr. Analia Gomez Vidal, and I know what it takes because I have been there myself. Now I coach and mentor international graduate students and professionals navigating life and career transitions across industries and countries through my company, AGV Services LLC. Join our community to continue our conversation in between episodes and receive my career development reflections and resources through our Patreon at patreon.com/lucky to be here. Paid subscribers also have access to monthly live chats and behind the scenes updates. Welcome to Lucky to be here. I am really glad you are. Today, I am really excited to have this conversation with Dr. Gertrude Nonterah. Dr. Gertrude Nortra has a Ph.D. in microbiology and immunology. She's a scientific communications professional by day and shares post-Ph.D. career insights for those seeking careers outside academia. Gertrude recently published a book called Navigating the P.I.V.O.T, which is a handbook for PhDs and academics looking to pivot to fulfilling careers outside the ivory tower. Gertrude, thank you so much for joining me today and liking to be here.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be here.
So, to get us started, for those who don't know you, where are you from? Where have you been? And where are you now?
So I originally I was born and raised in Ghana and West Africa. I lived part of my life in the United Kingdom for a little bit when my father was studying for his own PhD, and then lived in Ghana again for until I was 20 years old, then moved to the US um, more than 20 years ago. And where have I been? So I've been here in the US for the last 20 years. And where am I going? We'll see. We'll see as the episode goes along as to where I'm going.
Excellent. So you are no stranger to pivots, both in terms of locations and careers.
Mhm.
And so you mentioned, that you had that experience of living in the UK and also your dad going through his PhD. I am curious to hear what recollections do you have of that process for him as you were growing up?
Mm. I think one of the memories I have, because I was pretty young at the time, but one of the memories I have is that he worked really hard. My father I'm kind of like him, and he has a really great work ethic. And so as a PhD student, clearly he wasn't at home a lot. But when he was, he spent time with us. He spent time with his family. And so I remember that. And growing up, I remember that very distinctly about him and thinking, he's still alive, thank goodness. But and I'm grateful that I have him around to enjoy. But one of the things that I admired about him growing up was that even though he had his profession as a researcher, and then at some point even as an adjunct professor as well, in addition to being a researcher, he always made time for family. And so that's something that I always admired about him and wanted to incorporate into my own life.
Yeah. It's so impressive to see in our stories how like those early memories and reference points come up again. I resonate a lot with that, with my dad being an entrepreneur, and so then kind of like having that sense of like, oh, this is a path that is out there. And
Yeah.
related to that, do you recall the first time that you were like, okay, so the PhD is my route now too?
Mm. So initially, when I went to college, my goal was to go to medical school. So when I took on biology as a major, my goal was pre-med, going to medical school. But then, as an international student at the time, I don't know if it's changed, but I came to college here in the early 2000s, so 2003. And back then, and I graduated college somewhere 2007, 2006. And back then, in order to go to medical school, you needed a cosigner to co-sign a loan for you in order for you to be able to go to medical school here in the US. And the person needed to be a permanent resident or a citizen, and I wasn't. I was just an
Mhm.
F1 international student here in the US. And so it was close to impossible to get that. So as I was coming to the end of my college degree and I realized, hey, medical school may not be the path I can actually travel on here in the US, I began to think of alternative paths. And of course, my father had a PhD. So I was like, I'll do that because he's done it and he's been pretty successful in his profession. So maybe I can do that and be successful as well. I wasn't so, thankfully for me, some people are very, it's medicine or bust. I
Mhm.
was never like that. I was just like, medicine is what I wanted. But if that didn't pan out the way that I hoped, then I would definitely go the PhD route. And so that's what I ended up doing.
Yeah. And another layer of that, it's this or nothing that comes up a lot is the intention behind starting a PhD, right? So, like, we hear a lot, maybe people start the PhD being like academia or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are those of us who are like, well, we'll see what comes up, right? How did you feel about that layer as you were starting your PhD? Did you
Yeah.
foresee a career in academia necessarily?
Yeah, part of me did. A part of me did. A part of me liked the idea of being a professor, teaching students. And I got to live part of that out as an adjunct instructor at a community college. Some people say that that's not really college. I beg to differ because when you do transfer credits from a community college to a 4-year college, they're considered college credits. So
Mhm.
it is higher education still. But anyway, I got to do that, and I got to see what it was like being an instructor or professor to these students. And it was so great to mentor them, especially because a lot of them were kind of like me when I was in my undergrad. A lot of them wanted to go to medical school and dental school and pharmacy school. They were all bio majors. And so I got to live that part of it out. However, I realized uh, through that journey that academia is not very, first of all, there's a lot of feelings, but academia doesn't pay very well. That's one of the layers of it, right? When you work for instance, in the community college world, that doesn't pay well. It's gratifying work, and I'll be honest, I had a great department. I had a great department head, but it wasn't paying very well. And because I was an adjunct, I wasn't even getting benefits.
Mhm.
So, and if you, for those listening that may not be conversant with that, in a lot of jobs in the United States, when you are full time, you get benefits like retirement accounts or health insurance, dental insurance, vision insurance, and all these are forms of compensation, right? They're part of your total compensation package. So even if you go, whether you work in academia or outside of academia, right, it's part of your total compensation package. But when you teach at the community college level, you only get paid hourly. You
Mhm.
don't even get paid anything. So anything outside of that. The community college I was teaching at, they would allow you to have health insurance after I think 4 consecutive semesters of teaching there. That's almost 2 years before you would even qualify to sign up for benefits, right? So there was a lot in that that I was like, I don't know. I've been to school and I'm getting paid less than, I don't know, almost the same amount as somebody that works at the grocery store. So I began to get, I definitely got disillusioned by that, and began to look, and that wasn't the only thing. There were other
Yeah.
things leading up to that. I began to look for other opportunities outside of academia.
Yeah, it
So
makes sense.
yeah, so that's how it's been for me. It wasn't, I never had this like really, and maybe that was part of my problem. I never really had
Mhm.
this concrete like vision of the future of this is what I want to do. I just knew that I wanted to be successful. I knew I wanted to
Mhm.
achieve the highest type of degree because it would open up opportunities for me, but I never had that. It was after I finished that I even began to think about, okay, where am I going to be career wise? I don't recommend that to people now because I
Mhm.
realized that if I had done more of that as a PhD student, maybe I wouldn't have struggled as much when I came out of my PhD. So that's just a little bit about my career journey.
Yeah, and I want to speak to a couple things that you mentioned because I think that those are like really important points to consider as you navigate this path, and especially as an international student and professional. Like on one hand, having a clear sense of like what success means to you at each point in time and what you're willing to deal with as a trade-off as you're working towards that vision for yourself, while at the same time having to remain flexible enough for what's possible, right? And so, like, what I am hearing from you is a little bit of that kind of like push and pull, or like, okay, like my definition of success includes a certain level of compensation that I'm not getting here. Or similar to when you were thinking about, like, okay, what's the next step post graduation from college? And it's like, well, medicine, but we need to like be more creative and open, right? And one thing that I wanted to speak to in this line of reasoning, let's say, is some of the trade-offs that we accept, especially as we're going through our graduate school programs and after. So as you were talking about compensation, like that was very similar to my case, right? Like I did not have any 401k, 403b until like many years past graduation because of the nature of the jobs that I have had over time. And as you were thinking about your career, and especially as an international student in the US, what were the factors that weigh in more for you to think about, let's keep going in this direction in the US, even if it is not the ideal that I had in mind?
Yeah, there's so many layers to that question. So let me give a few answers. Let me start. First of all, when you're an international student, your status in the US is very precarious. It's not certain. And I think that also played into my story, right? Was I was finishing this PhD with F1 OPT. So I was working on optional practical training. And when you're on that, you're not even sure of what the next 3 years are going to be, or like after that are going to be. At that time, now it's more common for people to go into the EB2 visa and some of these other visas that are available. But back then, I didn't know anything about this path, right? And so I actually heard about applying or petitioning the government to become a permanent resident through the EB2 pathway through a friend, right? Through a friend I went to high school with, whose spouse had gone through the same process. And so she was like, hey, why don't you try this out? And so I did. So it was after I applied for that I was like, oh, okay, I'm beginning to feel settled in myself. Until then, I always compared to like walking on a tightrope over the Niagara Falls. You don't know when you're going to fall. You don't know what the government is going to say. It's a very shaky place to be.
Mhm,
So that played into the fact that I didn't even know where my career was going for a little bit. And maybe somebody will say, oh, maybe you could have gone back home, which is true. I've seen people who have come here to the United States to study and then gone back to their home countries. That's a
mhm,
perfectly viable path. For me, I had different goals. And so, and one of those goals was to make some money, right? I had been here, I had spent a lot of money on school. My PhD wasn't, of course, that was fully funded, so that was fine. But from undergrad and all that, I
mhm,
had spent money. And so I wanted to make it pay off in some way, right? I'm just being honest. I just wanted to make it
mhm,
pay off in some way. So I went into a postdoc because first of all, that was the only type of role I could get because a lot of jobs would say we don't sponsor people or we don't file green cards for people or whatever. So once I found the EB2 pathway, I became more stable in myself. So
mhm,
that's the first thing is like even getting stability of my status here in the US was really essential, right?
mhm,
So once that was stable, now I began to think, okay, gee, what do you really want to do? But it was around that same time as just when I was getting my stability that I was laid off from my postdoc. Right? It was just around that same time that my PI was like, "Oh, we're running out of funds. I have to let you all go in 90 days." And I was like, "Oh, shoot." Like I just figured this part
Mhm.
of my life out. And now this sort of safety boat of a postdoc that I was in is being pulled out from under me, right? Okay, so now that's pulled out. And I have a green card, but now I don't have a job,
Mhm.
right? So then I had to think, what's the next step? I began applying to different academic positions. I applied to even second postdocs, instructor positions, and so on. And I wasn't getting anything. So in my postdoc, I had started a side hustle as a freelance writer. That's what ultimately led me to scientific communications, which is what I'm doing now. But in the midst of freelancing, I found the adjunct professor position. But I knew that, and like I was telling you earlier, Analia, the adjunct professor position, even though I'm very grateful for it because
Mhm.
when I got that job, I had come off a long season of looking for jobs and being totally unsuccessful. And so getting that finally like sort of validated, like, okay, I'm not completely dumb, right? Because I
Mhm.
think one of the feelings you can go through, especially as an international, as an immigrant,
Mhm.
right, is a lot of people, and thankfully, like, people back home were not necessarily looking up to me to like send money back home or support them. Nobody, I didn't have that. But when you have moved all the way from your country to another country, you put this heavy expectation in yourself to succeed. And so when I had finally gotten some stability, but then the postdoc was taken away from me. And then for 18 months, I just like kept on hitting my head against the wall
Mhm.
trying to find a job. It felt very disempowering and discouraging because I was like, here I am. I'm supposed to be successful in America, and I'm very unsuccessful because I have a PhD and I can't find a job. So that was a very demoralizing season.
Yeah.
But it was also the season that where I finally began to tease out for myself, what do I really want? Because I had come
Mhm.
here, had gone to school and finished with a PhD, which was great. But then now I had to sit down and think. And school is kind of stepwise. It's
Mhm.
automatic. Like if you do well, you get good grades, you move on to the next step. But the career world is amorphous. It's not so stepwise. And I had to learn that the hard way. But once I figured out that, okay, I like writing, I like communicating science, I love teaching my students, I wrapped all of those experiences up and then have parlayed that into my scientific communications career. So it's been a lot, like a bit of
Yeah.
a journey of self discovery, of like
Mhm.
stability and self discovery, and just, yeah, I'll say
Yeah.
stability and self discovery. I hope that
And
answered the question.
100%. And also, I think it speaks to something that I think you might agree with me in saying this, which is one of the biggest pieces of advice that I share with prospective graduate students or graduate students is this is a time of self discovery and exploration.
Hmm.
You get to use this as a playground to really understand what works best for you. And that is true for all students, domestic or international students. But I think that also I resonate a lot with your story because, it reminds me of my own struggles, like career pivoting and visa changing and all this stuff. And one of the things that I think is so important and a lot of people in career development miss is how fundamentally intertwined the career journey is with the immigration journey for all of us. And I've had colleagues in career development kind of like question, my trajectory because of, like changing jobs every couple of years or every 3 years, without them understanding that every job was tied to a different visa status. So I was constantly in the job market, whether it was like actively applying or learning about it. And they don't necessarily, if you're not aware of it, you don't understand that the way that the metaphor that I use, like instead of the Niagara Falls that you use, is basically like building a castle in the air. You're just hoping to find some footing for yourself, but you know that you're building in the middle of a storm and you don't know what direction that storm is going to go.
Unfortunately, in the US, there's no straight path. In a lot
Mhm.
of other countries, there are some like very structured programs. In the US, you kind of have to like figure out, okay, which one of these visas actually fits what I'm trying to do. So it can be very, very confusing. So I totally also relate with having to change jobs or having to like, well, why did you do this thing that way? And it's like, it's kind of related to how my visa is set up, and I don't have a choice. These are the only choices I have. So yeah, absolutely. For anybody feeling like that, just know that we've all walked through that. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and also speaks to the need of what we were talking about earlier of like the creativity, right? Of like knowing that you have a vision, knowing that you have a definition of success, but that you also need to be flexible enough to work with the
Hmm.
constraints and environment
Yeah.
to make it happen in your own terms. And I think this is also a good segue. I Because I feel in the midst of this, but I know you also have that experience of not just as an immigrant, but also as an entrepreneur. Like it feels like entrepreneurship is also about like building a castle in the middle of the air and hoping that it lands. And so I'm curious to hear, as you are starting to tease out what speaks to you as a, in science communication, but also developing this side hustle that eventually ended up being the Bull PhD.
Yes.
Um, what was that experience like for you?
Yes. So the Bold PhD was born out of a bit of frustration because when I was trying to figure out how to move outside of academia, the resources available were there were resources, there were some resources, but they were very like you have to pay to get this, you have to pay to get a resume writer. And I'm talking about this is 2018, 2019ish. So it's not too long ago, right? Things have changed drastically since this time. It's just 7 years ago, but I've watched things change drastically. And back then, the biggest resource that was out there was a blog called The Cheeky Scientist. That particular company has gone through a lot of questionable, like been a lot of
Mhm,
controversy around them, but they were the only ones that were even giving anything that was a bit comprehensive, right? I never bought any of their programs, but I remember reading their blogs. And I remember there was a blog where they talked about translating resumes. So like, your skills and the way you talk about yourself in academia is not the way you talk about yourself to industry jobs. And I was like, what? Like, so because the whole time I was applying to these industry jobs and I was definitely applying with an academic CV. And so
mhm,
now in hindsight, I see why I was ignored for a really long time because I was presenting myself as this high and mighty academic, whereas in industry, they have specific problems and they're looking for somebody who can solve that specific problem. And you have to position yourself as that problem solver. So when I went through that process and then I took my CV and then converted it to a resume, not really converted,
mhm,
but changed it and repositioned myself so that I was actually talking to the need of what like as they would need for a science writer. And I got that first job. I was like, oh, this works, right?
yeah,
This works. I went from having a 4-page CV to a 1-page resume. And even on that resume, I never listed my publications. I never listed the conferences I had spoken at. I didn't list all the regular academic things we have on an academic resume. Even though that was impressive in academia, it
mhm,
was not impressive to the people in industry. They just wanted to know, can you help me do this thing? Right. So once I figured that out, right, I was like, listen, I don't have time to be coaching people per se. And I have coached some people, but I don't do that. I don't do much of that anymore. But I was like, I feel like this is information that needs to be open and out there. There's no need for us to, gatekeep and shield everything. So there were people who were already talking about it, but then I started on LinkedIn to talk about the fact that I had been jobless. I had been a jobless
Mhm.
PhD. And I
Yeah.
didn't realize the impact that would create, because then all of a sudden my DM started to flood with messages from people who were like, yes, I am so ashamed. I'm also a PhD who has been on the job market for a long time. And it's so embarrassing to tell people. So thank you for sharing your story. Right. And so I began to realize, wait, like this, and this was somewhere in 2019. This is an area where nobody really talks. When a PhD has been jobless, I never saw
Mhm.
anybody talk. Now it's more common, but I never saw anybody talk about the fact that they were a PhD and jobless, right? So when I started talking about it, I think I'm not saying that I pioneered anything,
Mhm.
right? But I began to see more people also
Yeah.
open up. All right. And then I began to talk about my career in science writing. As my career was taking off, I was beginning to share, because I had been a freelancer for a while. So I had some skills. And so I began to share how I had been able to convince this hiring manager to hire me. I began to see people respond to that. And then I began to interview other PhDs who had chosen that different path, right? Because the
Mhm.
regular path, and it's so interesting because statistically, they're actually only going to be about 20% of PhDs who end up as tenured
Mhm.
professors, right? But somehow we make it seem like industry is the other thing, right? A
Mhm.
lot of us are going to end up outside of academia. So
Yeah.
it's funny to me that it's almost like when people, that's why I don't like the term alt ac,
Mhm.
because alt ac suggests that a majority of people are in academia, and then a few people, but the reality is that a majority of us are going to be outside of academia anyway. That's beside the point. So once I began to share that, I realized, oh, this is a need. And then interestingly, I didn't plan to start speaking on these career development topics, but I started to get invitations from career development leaders at universities to speak. And at first it was confusing because I was like, what is going on? What is happening? The first one I got, they said, we want you to come and talk, because I also began to talk about personal branding. Personal
Mhm.
branding is something I had done before I started to talk about the post PhD stuff. I had done it for my freelance writing business. And through personal branding, I had been able to attract clients. So I also began to think, okay, how can I connect personal branding to careers or building a career? And I was seeing that pay off, because in my first science writer role, they had looked at my LinkedIn, they liked my presence, they looked at my
Mhm.
YouTube channel, and like, you seem to have this marketing gene. We want you on our team, right? So that was the first sign of me seeing that, oh, cultivating a personal brand can actually open doors for you. And
Yeah.
so I began to speak on that. And then now that has turned into the book, and I've consulted with universities. So initially I was just planning on, hey, I struggled through this process. It took me a year and a half. So let me share everything I know.
Mhm.
And when I began to be real and raw about my journey, I saw people coming along with that. And that's how it all
Yeah.
started.
Um, I also, as you describe this, you take me back to that time. And I do remember that, if you wanted to be successful in the academic market, the reference point at that point in time was the professor is in who has the
Mhm.
book. And so, like, you would have that, or you would have this other company that you mentioned that I did invest in their programs. And that's all that I'm going to say. I am here today. Um, but there was very much like the change and the shifts in the markets have been like tremendous, especially from that point on to now. And like we are constantly seeing like changes. But I think that one aspect that I take away from your description that speaks to me a lot is, and I think that there is an interesting connection there between the Bolt PhD and what I often say of like Bolt moves are built from within, because there is that sense of like self identity and being able to kind of like allow yourself to discover and explore what's coming up, what's resonating, and how it's also bringing people together, helping them feel seen and supported
Mhm.
through these processes where, like, for a lot of us, they felt very lonely. And I remember as an international, I started doing my exploration of career development as an international student, like very early on in my PhD process, because I knew that as an international student, I would struggle a lot. And so then, like having people like you come out and share and be able to create those resources, it is absolutely essential for, anyone going through that process feeling like, oh, is it just me? And it's like, no, it's not.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where I wanted to come from, right? It's easy when everything has gone well for you, and that's fine. For some people, things have gone very well for them and they share from that point of view. But I also realize that I connect a lot with with people that have kind of struggled and stumbled on their own journey, because that was my journey before I finally figured it out. So I think that there is a need, like sometimes there's a need for people to also see that, listen, all of us, we're all in this together. Like none of us has it all together. And it's fine for the people that have had it perfect and smooth and it's gone well. But there's something to be said about speaking from experience to people, and it connects with people. I found that I've connected with people sometimes and yeah, and then it's also like I don't share my family all that much, but
Mhm.
people do know that I am a mother, right? And so you're balancing this career and then entrepreneurship with motherhood. And so there is like there's also that. There's also that where you connect with certain people just based on that. So I think I brought more of a personal, that's back to going to a personal brand. I brought more of
Mhm.
my personal brand into the Bold PhD, and it's worked out. Yeah.
Mhm. If there is one thing that you find yourself saying a lot to people and that you want more people to really hear and take with them, what would you say that is?
I'd say be like Analia and start your career development research early, or start building your career early. So a lot of people, when they're in PhD programs or in college, they think I have time, right? It's 5 years, 6 years. I have time. Let me just put my head down and do the work and my work will speak for itself. That was me.
Mhm.
Right. That was definitely me, where I was like, if I put my head down, if I work hard, because that's the only paradigm I knew. If I
Yes.
work hard, life will reward me. And then I worked really hard and life did not reward me. Right. Because when it comes to building your career outside of school, it's not your grades. As
Mhm.
much as they tell us it's our grades, it's not really your grades get you to a certain point. Your grades will allow you to get into graduate school. Your grades will allow you to get into certain types of institutions. It's true. Your grades are important. But once that degree is handed to you, your grades no longer matter. And unfortunately, I bought into the path through that my grades would matter. So I hyper focused on that. And of course I did well. But then when it came to the other side, which was job searching, networking, personal branding, now I knew none of these things. And I had to learn by basically trial and error and fire. Right? Because
Mhm.
now it's thrown into the water. It's kind of like, so you throw somebody into the deep end, they have to figure out how to swim or else they'll drown. That was me. Right. And so if there's one thing I find myself telling people over and over again, is that don't just hyper focus on your studies, don't just hyper focus on your research, right? Do that. I want you to do well. I want you to excel. By the time I was done with my PhD and my postdoc, I had multiple published papers, right, for my field. It was a pretty decent amount of papers. I had done well, right? But I didn't know anything about all of these things when it came to career development. And I had to learn it just like I say, trial, error, and
Mhm.
fire, right?
Yes.
So I don't want that for people, because it's very, very uncomfortable when you finally have your degree and you don't have a job and you're now learning that I have to what? I have to network. I have to I have to talk to people, and I'm an ambivert. So there's a part of me that's strongly introverted, and I have the part of
Mhm.
me that's extroverted. The introvert side of me is like, I don't want to talk to people, right? But I had to start doing that. I didn't want to write on LinkedIn, but I had to start
Mhm.
writing on LinkedIn because I had to put myself out there somehow so that somebody would know I existed, right? So I had to learn all those things the hard way. You don't have to do it that way. You can
Yeah.
start planting the seeds,
Mhm.
build no this one thing I say, dig the well before you need it, right?
Mhm.
So that means that when you go to conferences, you should be speaking to people. That means that you should be getting in touch with your alumni network that is in industry, if that's where you want to end up. Or if you want to go into academia, start talking to people. And even within academia, there are different institutions. Do you want to be at an Ivy League?
Yeah.
Start networking with those people. Do you want to be at a non-Ivy League, but it's an R1 university? Start speaking to people there. Maybe you want to teach at community college. Like whatever it is, you need to start intentionally, right? Putting yourself out there and getting known, because I remember this was in 2017 or 2018. I used to carpool in my neighborhood. There was a carpool to work to where I worked. And in the carpool was somebody who was an HR person working for UC San Diego. And we were having a discussion. I forget exactly what the discussion was about, but she said something I will never forget. She said, you know something, we never hire people off of the people that apply online. And I said, what? And she said, yeah, when we post a role, we don't hire people who apply online. I've only done that once. And the one time I did that, it didn't work out. And I was like, really? And she said, yes, most of the hires come from other professors recommending professors. I was like, that's so wild.
So it's interesting you mentioned that because a few weeks ago I was invited to class with graduate students, and I mentioned to them two things that I did as part of my professional development before I even hit the time of the job market. One of which was to identify all of the faculty who had started as international student and taken the tenure track job after graduation, because I wanted to understand the immigration path for them and what was possible. And then the second one was treating the academic market just like the non-academic market in terms of networking with people, reaching out to the schools, learning about the processes, like understanding what they needed. And that made a huge difference for me when I was going through the academic market at the same time of the non-academic market. And so like what you're describing is basically an example of that, right? Like you were in the carpool and you hear this thing about like, oh, this is information that is important for me so that I can be strategic when I apply.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I think, in a nutshell, what we're saying is start early. Be like, that's why I said be like Analia. Start early. I didn't start early, and I paid for it. So start early.
One other thing that I want to acknowledge too, and I think that, this is something that we both experience, and a lot of people listening and people who are, international students and workers, immigrants in general, or first generation to experience, is this tension between, being told to keep our heads down and work hard and the work will speak for itself, and just like don't complain, don't take up space, just work, 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 and that will in itself translate into the opportunities down the line. And also, on the other hand, this very real need of like having to take up space and advocate for oneself and really understanding what we want, how we want it, and what is possible. And so I think that that is something that is like we see it so present in our own experiences and others as well. Of and so I think that this is a good opportunity to kind of like give that permission slip of you can take up space. Yeah, in fact, you should take up space. You should advocate for yourself because you can work hard and that will be part of you. But for you to be seen and to be heard, you also need to take that next step.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. Everything you said.
So we are getting close to the end today, and I could speak for hours with
Yes,
you.
absolutely.
But
one last question that I have for you is, if you were to meet that version of yourself who just started in the US in your college degree and kind of like thinking about where you wanted to go next, what advice would you give her?
Yes, I would tell her that it's all going to be okay, because when you're in the midst of joblessness and confusion and not even being stable in the US, it can be very discouraging. And you can always feel like, again, like in any minute somebody's going to pull a rug from under you. So I would tell her that everything is going to be okay. I would tell her to not again, not just focus on her studies, but to also look for opportunities and avenues, and talk to people about their career path so she could learn more about those career paths and make more informed decisions before she needed them. And then I would also say that the last thing I would say is that money is important. A lot of people, I remember there was a viral post, this was maybe somewhere in 2020, there's a viral post that I wrote. I didn't think it was going to go viral. It went viral. And I had a lot of people commenting, giving me their ideas, some of them not so nice. And I talked about money, right?
Mhm,
And I talked about money, and people were in the comments, especially academics, like, money is not that important. You shouldn't get a PhD for money. And I was like, that's a nice thing to say until you cannot pay your bills, right? It's a
mhm,
really nice thing to say that you shouldn't care about the money until you realize that you've done all this schooling, you've made all these sacrifices, and society doesn't reward that, right? So I think you should care about money. If you want to take a position just for the money, you should do it. Not in a selfish, greedy kind of way. That's not what I'm suggesting. But the reality is that our productive working lives, or the amount of time you have in the workforce before people start to think that you're too old, it happens to all of us, right?
mhm,
And so you should be building. And this doesn't mean I can go on a whole other tangent about retirement. I don't like the idea of retirement, but that's beside the point. But the reality is that at some point you'll be required to retire. When you
mhm,
have to retire, you're no longer working for a formal institution, and so but you still have to live. It's very, very. The other day I was watching this video. I didn't even watch it, but I saw the title of some of the generation that cannot retire, and it was, I
mhm,
think, about some baby boomers who cannot retire, not because they don't want to, but because they don't have the money to. So think about not just today and affording your bills and affording the food, but think about future you. Think about you who is now 65 years old and needs to survive, right? That's what you're building for. You're not just building for today. So when I talk about money, I'm not just talking about today. I'm talking about when you are at that place where you are not as young and springy as you used to be, right? So if you want to take something for money because you want to build wealth, I say do it because it's important and you deserve it. So that's what I would
mhm.
tell her.
And if I can add a 2 cents to that, I myself struggle with this, and I'm learning a lot through entrepreneurship about it. But I think that I want to second what you were saying, also because you might not take the money, but who else is taking it, right? And so there are a lot of ways in which the systems that are at play prey on the over romanticization of doing the work for the love of the work. But at the end of the day, if we're not able to cover our needs, it's also self abandonment.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we also see very often the precarity in which a lot of PhD graduates end up finding themselves in part because there is this conditioning that we constantly need to fight against in many ways. Because at the end of the day, we live in an environment, in a system that requires money to
Hmm.
survive
Yeah,
and cover
exactly.
our needs. And
Exactly.
it is not something to be ashamed of. It
Hmm.
is something to be cognizant of.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. No, absolutely. Don't be ashamed of the money. I don't know. I don't know why we were conditioned to to assume that money is evil. And even with going outside of academia, people say, oh, you're going to the dark side. I'm like, why is it the dark side? Because they pay more? right? Like, why is it the dark side? It's not the dark side if you want to. It's not the dark side if you want to give your children a different life. It's not a dark side if you want to build wealth. It's not the dark side. So I think that idea of wealth building as, oh, it's so evil. I wish more academics would lose that.
Thank you so much for your time today, G. This has been like an incredible conversation that I look forward to repeating at some point.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, how can people find you online?
Yes. So I have a free I have a free freebie for your audience. They can go to theboldphd.com/careers list, theboldphd.com/careers list, and it will lead you to a sign up form, and I give you 35 different non-academic careers that you can consider to help you spark some ideas, as well as some career paths within academia that are not necessarily classroom based career paths. So I have these freebies that you can download for your own research, right? I didn't know these parts, and so I want to just pay for it. So you can go there. I also recently wrote a book where I talk specifically, like give a step by step on how to plan for working outside of academia and land that job that pays you well and also is fulfilling for you. And that you can find that at theboldphd.com/navigate, because it's navigating the pivot. So theboldphd.com/navigate, or you can just find me on Amazon. Just type in Gertrude Nonterah Navigating the Pivot and you should find it.
And we will also include all the links in the show notes as well. Thank
Absolutely.
you again so much. And I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for having me.
That is the end of today's episode. Thank you for listening to Lucky to Be Here. I am your host, Dr. Analia Gomez Vidal. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening and leave us your review. Join us on Patreon at patreon.com/lucky to be here to continue our conversation and to get my reflections and resources for career development too. See you next time.